We're still on the part on psychical individuation, chapter 2 of that part, I believe. Chapter 3, sorry, of that part. And then we're starting section 4 of that chapter. So we're on page 304 of the translation for those following along. So last time we read section 3, which had to do with the notion of bisubstantialism. So the idea that the body and the soul or the mind are two separate, distinct substances. And of course, Simondon criticizes this notion effectively on the grounds that it ignores the genesis of the person, of the individual. It treats the body and the soul as entities that have no genesis, that have no that don't undergo individuation. They're already individuated. This last section had a few sort of digressions that were interesting, but not like in that direct line of argument. But the one of them had to do with imminence versus transcendence, and I think we'll see more on that today. So in relation to the idea of whether there's something in the human being as a person that is transcendent, that is sort of non-natural, or whether, on the other hand, everything in the human being can be explained as arising from experience or from the natural reality in some sense of that term. And so Simondon, as usual, is going to question this sort of dichotomy between imminence and transcendence, and he's going to argue that the individuated reality, so the human being as an already individuated entity, is not the complete reality. Doesn't contain everything that goes into making up that being. So there's the being prior to individuation, and then there, out of that pre-individuated being or unindividuated being, there arises an individual as a portion or only a part of that reality. And so only the individual and its associated milieu together make up the complete reality. So when we talk about imminence versus transcendence, they're both partly right or both partly wrong, in the sense that the human individual as an individuated being can't account for everything in human reality or the reality of the human being, because that individual is always coordinate with an associated milieu, and only together with that milieu makes up the complete reality. But at the same time, that transcendent or that aspect that goes beyond the already individuated human being is not itself something that has the character of an individual. So the idea of a personal divinity, so something that would itself have the character of individuality, is not something that we can use in this connection. So instead of starting from already individuated beings and then trying to account for human reality in terms of imminence or transcendence, we have to account for human reality in terms of its genesis and the process of individuation. Oh, and maybe one last bit about last time. We also saw the last little bit had a sort of a piece on animals as sort of purely corporeal, or this representation of animals as purely corporeal, as opposed to the human, in which the psychical reality would sort of subordinate the somatic or corporeal reality. And Simondon points to the fact that in animals you have there is instinctive behavior, but there's also behavior that organizes, that solves problems. There's not just a fixed repertoire of behaviors that are triggered by some sort of stimulus, as some representations of animal behavior would put it, but instead you have a sort of problem-solving capacity that requires something like a creativity in animals, and so we can't sort of deny a psychical reality to animals as well, and we can't at the same time define the human as something that goes beyond animal reality in that sense. Okay, so let's start on today's reading. So I'll read, I think this is one of these, oh, actually, no, there's a couple paragraphs here. So so we're starting at page 304 at the section break there. Right, so I'll read a page or so and then we'll go around. Insufficiency of the notion of adaptation to explain psychical individuation. One of the most characteristic traits of modern psychology and psychopathology is that they contain an implicit sociology that is inherent particularly to the normativity of their judgments. Certainly, these disciplines claim not to be normative and want to be merely objective. They are objective, no doubt, but from the moment that the necessity of the distinction between the normal and the pathological appears, from the moment that it is merely necessary to determine a hierarchy by classifying behaviors or states according to a scale of levels, normativity once again arises. If we define this implicit normativity, it is not to argue against it in this part of our study, but because it obscures a whole aspect of the representation of the individual. If dynamics is included in the implicit normativity, one will be able to construct a psychological theory of the individual within which it will seem that no dynamics is presupposed. In fact, this dynamics is present in implicit normativity, but it does not appear as a dynamics inherent to the object studied. If we analyze the complete content of the dynamic notions employed by modern psychology, such as the normal and the pathological, high-level states and low-level states, states of elevated psychical tension and states of low psychical tension, we would find that this implicit normativity conceals a sociology and even a sociotechnics that do not belong to the explicit foundations of psychology. Perhaps this remark would even be valid for the psychological doctrines of previous centuries, since they seem to be exempt from any theory of society, and because sociology had not been constituted as an autonomous discipline. In Malebranche, for example, we can discover a certain conception of human freedom and of individual responsibility founded on the fact that each being has a movement to always go further. In Mendebiran, the hierarchy of 3 lives supposes a certain representation of inter-individual relation. Lastly, even in the work of Rousseau, whom we are taking as a general example of the authors that sought to construct a doctrine of the individual grasped in his solitude, virtue and consciousness involve an implicit presence of relation. But this incapacity of psychological thought facing the analysis of its presuppositions is particularly notable in the most recent developments of this discipline. As an example, if we take the address of Dr. Kubi to the 1949 Macy Conference of Cybernetics, we find that the author legitimizes his distinction of the normal and the pathological in individual behavior through the criterion of adaptation. This is indicated by the title of his study, The Neurotic Potential in Human Adaptation. He attempts to show that a behavior governed by neuropathic forces and presenting certain analogies with normal behavior is ultimately exposed due to the fact that the subject cannot be satisfied with any of his successes. Neuropathic potentials are distinguished from normal forces by the continual disadaptation of the subject that they animate. This subject is neither happy nor satisfied. Even if seen from outside, his behavior seems to involve success. As the author states, this is because there is an immense gap between the goal pursued by the neuropathic potentials and the conscious goal that the subject seeks and can effectively attain. When the overarching and consciously sought goal is finally reached, the subject understands that he has been the victim of an illusion and that this is not yet his true goal. He is not satisfied and he sees that he never will be. This may then be the moment of despair, which is incomprehensible for someone who sees from outside this drama of the neuropathic quest. At the height of their career, an engineer or a writer commits suicide without any apparent cause. Their success was not a veritable adaptation. At least for a time, neurotics often seem to excel normal subjects. This is because they work and act under the influence of neuropathic potentials. But sooner or later, neurosis manifests. Dr. Kubi cites several cases to illustrate his thesis, particularly the case of a man who, during World War II, was awarded several military medals for his heroic conduct and his remarkable aggressiveness. He had managed to leave the desk job to which he was assigned in order to partake in battle in an extremely courageous way. However, after the end of the war, this man's severe neurosis manifested and forced him to seek psychiatric help. Similarly, according to the author, one often finds in universities certain campus heroes, an expression whose literal meaning is heroes of the university grounds, but this expression has a value similar to phrases like heroes of the honor roll or heroes of the court of honor. These heroes are neurotics who mask their inability to adapt by excelling in the intellectual or athletic domain, and who find in the laurels they receive a provisional means of ensuring their integration into the society in which they live. Later on, neurosis. So we can stop here for discussion. So here the problem that he's setting out, or the question to discuss, is this notion of adaptation in psychology and in psychopathology. So the idea that there are certain states of an individual in which they're adapted to external reality, to their environment, and then there are other states in which they're not adapted. And this notion of adaptation already presupposes a certain representation of social organization, or of what a relationship between individuals consists in. Namely, it's already indicating that the social relationship should be understood in terms of something like a pre-existing reality to which the individual has to adapt. And this this sociological presupposition is not explicitly stated, so psychologists just use terms like normal and pathological, or adaptive and non-adaptive behavior, and they don't necessarily make explicit what sociological principles they're presupposing. And so this already applies to authors from before sociology as a discipline was established. So you can look at authors from the 18th or 19th century, and you can, or even 17th century in the case of Malebranche. There you have some sort of presupposition of what social relationship consists in already implicit in their explanations of what the individual as a psychological reality consists in. And then Simondon turns to the example of this author, Dr. Kubi, who I don't know anything about, but taken from the Macy Conference of Cybernetics in 1949. And this, the Macy Conference series, the Macy Conferences were sort of the foundational conferences for cybernetics as a discipline. It was at these conferences that the term cybernetics itself was sort of popularized and established. And the idea was to sort of bring together scientists in a number of different fields, like mathematicians, computer engineers in the early stages of development of computers, physiologists, psychiatrists, etc. Bring them all together and develop these sort of general concepts of communication and control that would apply across all these different fields. And so here we have this Dr. Kubi presenting an idea of a sort of misadaptation. So there would be certain instances where these people who appear to be, from an external perspective, people appear to be adapted, like they're successful in their career or in whatever other circumstances you want to look at externally, but from a sort of internal point of view, they never feel that sense of accomplishment or of adaptation. And the hypothesis here is that this lack of adaptation, this neuropathic potential, is sort of what's driving their successes. So they sort of seek to compensate for this lack of adaptation by their achievements. And so someone may externally have all these achievements and seem to be successful in a lot of ways, precisely because they're trying to compensate for the lack of internal adaptation. And we'll continue. We'll see more about this example in the next few paragraphs. Okay, so let's go on to the next page or so, if someone else would like to read from Nevertheless, this criterion.
I can read. Nevertheless, this criterion of adaptation or adaptability, which is taken by Dr. Kubi as a principle of distinction between the normal and the pathological, presents a very serious possibility of confusion. Should adaptation be grasped in the relation of the individual to the group, or in the relation of the individual to himself? At the beginning of his address, Dr. Kubi establishes the nature of the logical and physical necessity of this criterion by assimilating it with the law of gravitation. It would be absurd to ask if any norm whatsoever requires matter to attract matter, for without this natural law, the world would not exist. Similarly, it is absurd to ask whether there is a norm that requires man to adapt to society. The very fact that the human world exists proves the existence of this norm of adaptation. It is a norm because it is a law that expresses the existence of a human world whose condition of possibility it is. However, this analogy is much too condensed to be considered a principle. Indeed, the physical world is not merely constituted by neutral matter, i.e. each particle attracting all the others and being attracted by them according to Newton's law. There are also electrical charges that polarize matter and make particles capable of a mutual repulsion stronger than Newtonian attraction, as can be seen currently in certain stable or unstable plasmas. There is a considerable difference between a field like the gravitational field and a field like an electrical field or a magnetic field. The latter actually involve a polarity, whereas the field of gravity does not. Finally, over and above electrical charges, be they associated with matter or not, and appearing as an electron or ion, potential or potential well, there is electromagnetic radiation, which can be grasped in all the degrees of the vast domain of transductivity it constitutes. If the physical universe were only constituted by neutral particles without polarity and without radiation, its properties would be totally different from what they are. The problem of physical individuality certainly would not be posed with such acuteness. There would then be no explanation for why a corpuscle like an electron, which repels other electrons with a force inversely proportionate to the distance between the corpuscles, is not dislocated by forces that should, by virtue of the preceding law, tend to dissociate its parts from one another. If the individual unity of the electron remains despite this law, this is because a reality distinct from attraction at a distance and from repulsion at a distance enters into play on the level of the particle. The physical individual cannot be treated according to laws derived from the study of interindividual relations, since if the individual exists, this is because the laws whose action is not observable on the individual level become predominant on the individual level. If there were only one type of relation, the individual would not be isolated from the whole into which it is integrated. In the same way, in psychology, the normality of the individual cannot be defined by a law that expresses the coherence of the world. Because if this law alone were valid, there would be no individual reality, and thus no problem of normality could intervene. Should I just finish this? It's one more paragraph.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Furthermore, in the description of the neuroses he recounted, Dr. Kubi indeed shows that the adaptation in question, which defines normality, is an adaptation of the individual not only to the human world but also to himself, because in formal terms, success, achievement, an enviable and envied situation, an honorable position, and wealth do not constitute satisfaction, without which there is no adaptation. However, a law comparable to that of gravitation in the physical world cannot determine in the human world whether a specific role suits a specific personality. The neurotic is one for whom no role is suitable and who therefore suffers from a constant disadaptation, not between his role in society, but between himself and his role in society. One can be disadapted without being neurotic and neurotic without being disadapted, because the compatibility or incompatibility in the relation of the individual to himself is not determined by the law of interindividual relation. And implicit sociology is not a guarantee of objectivity in psychology. It only keeps us from posing the problem of the relation of the individual to himself. Nevertheless, this question is posed on the level of physical thought itself. It is posed all the more in psychology due to the higher level of organization and the greater complexity of the individual within this domain. I like this point that you can't if it were the case that there was this kind of necessary law of inter-individual relation that, and if, I guess, gravity and the way that Dr. Kuvi uses it was a valid analogy, then the question of normativity wouldn't even come up, because you would really just have the group. And so it wouldn't even make sense to talk about the relation of the individual to the group.
Yeah, exactly. So even in the case of physical individuality, which is obviously much simpler than psychological individuality, in the case of physical individuality, we can only speak of a physical individual insofar as that individual is not purely governed by the same laws that constitute the relationships between those individuals. Because if there was just one universal law that covered everything, then there would be no distinct reality of the individual. It's only insofar as the individual operates under some different set of laws that we can actually distinguish it as an individual and separate it off from the rest of reality. So the electron doesn't repel itself, like it's even an electron repels other electrons of this, so they have the same charge and they have an electric field that repels, they repel each other. But an electron doesn't repel its own parts of itself, because it's when you get to the level of the electron, it is operating under different laws than electrons are operating with each other. So likewise, in the case of psychological reality, we have to assume that if there is something like a psychological individual, then the principles that govern the functioning of that individual have to be distinct from the principles that govern the relationships between individuals. And so because of this, we can't take this sort of simplistic idea that the existence of social reality is itself enough to give us our sort of implicit sociology and thus our account of normativity. We can't simply derive the normativity and the distinction between the normal and the pathological from this background sociology. We have to have an actual account of what the individual's psychological reality consists in, and what the relationship between individuals consists in order to have a grounding for any notion of normal and pathological, or any other normative notion. Right. Okay. So let's go on to the next section. Then this was a short section and relatively straightforward, I think. The next one is much less straightforward, but yeah, let's go on. Al, would you like to read, or if not, I can read this one as well.
I could try.
Sure.
Can you hear me? Is my volume too low?
No, it's good.
Okay. The problematic of reflexivity in individuation. The difficulty expressed by psychosociology of situating individual reality and defining adaptation seems to stem from the same origin as the difficulty that plagues scientific thought when it seeks to define physical individuality, wanting to grasp the being structure without operation and operation without structure. It either leads to an absolute substantialism or to an absolute dynamism that does not leave room for relation within the individual being. Relation becomes inessential. Even Bergson, who has made a remarkable effort to think the individual without allowing himself to be snared by a mental habit imported into psychology by a spirit accustomed to treating other problems, has remained too close to pragmatism. Like pragmatism, he has privileged intra-individual dynamism at the expense of structural realities that are just as intra-individual and important. It would be difficult to account for properly mental illness in Bergson's philosophy. According to the doctrine that we are expounding, the psychological individual, like the physical individual, is being constituted by the coherence of a domain of transactivity. In particular, and as a direct consequence of this nature, it is impossible to constitute in the study of the individual two types of forces or behaviors. Example, normal behaviors and pathological behaviors, certainly not because behaviors would be identical to one another, but precisely because they are so different from one another to be able to constitute two types alone. According to the point of view in which we are situated, either an infinity of types can be constituted or one alone, but never two alone. The constitution of two types does nothing but express the bipolarity of normativity, essential to a psychological classification that conceals an implicit sociology and sociotechniques. In fact, as in every domain of transactivity, there is the psychological individual, the unfolding of a reality that is simultaneously continuous and multiple. Bergson has seized upon this characteristic in one of its dimensions, i.e. the temporal dimension, but instead of studying the characteristics of relation according to the order of simultaneity more deeply, he has remained prejudiced against speciality, no doubt due to the abuses of psychological atomism, and has remained content with opposing the characters of the superficial self to those of the deeper self. However, transactivity on the psychological level is expressed by the relation between the transactive order of the simultaneous and the transactive order of the successive. Without this relation, psychological reality would not be distinct from physical reality. In the psychological domain, the relation that has the value of being is that of the simultaneous and successive. The different modalities of this relation are what constitute the domain of properly psychological transactivity, but they cannot be divided into kinds. They can only be hierarchized according to a given type of function. Ultimately, the very center of individuality, therefore, appears as reflexive self-consciousness. This expression being taken in its fullest sense, a non-reflexive consciousness, one that is incapable of introducing normativity derived from behavior into behavior itself, would not effectuate this domain of transactivity that constitutes the psychological individual. Indeed, the characteristic polarity of teleological behavior already appears on the biological level, but then it lacks this reciprocity between the order of the simultaneous and the order of the successive that constitutes psychological reality. Moreover, we do not mean by this to assert that there is a radical distinction between the biological order and the psychological order. By hypothesis alone, we are saying that pure biological reality would be constituted by the non-reciprocity of the relation between the domain of the simultaneous and that of the successive, whereas psychological reality is precisely the establishment of this reciprocity that can be called reflection. The pure living being indeed integrates its past experience into its present behavior, but it cannot carry out the inverse integration because it cannot introduce reflection, due to which the present behavior already imagined in its results and analyzed in its structure is placed on the same ontological level as the past behavior. For the pure living being, there's a heterogeneity between experience and behavior. For the psychological individual, there's a relative and progressive homogeneity of these two realities. Instead of sinking into the past by becoming pure experience, the past behavior conserves the characteristics of interiority that make it a behavior. It conserves a certain coefficient of presence. Inversely, the present behavior, consciously represented as that which will have consequences as effective as those that now constitute the real experience of the past, is already an experience in advance. The possibility of foresight and the possibility of remembering converge because they share the same nature and have a single function to establish the reciprocity of the order of simultaneous and the order of successive. Do I stop here?
Yeah, that's good. Thanks. Yeah, so let me just scroll back up a bit. So we're continuing with this problem of normativity in psychology and what it means to distinguish between a normal and a pathological state. And here we get Simondon's criticism of this distinction. So he argues that there are sort of that psychological realities are too heterogeneous to allow for distinguishing them into just two categories of normal and pathological. So you either have to distinguish infinitely many different types of psychological reality, or you group them all into one category, but there's no way to divide them up into just two categories. So he also makes this comment about Bergson, that he sort of privileges one side of the dynamic reality within the individual over the structural side, and whereas what we want to be able to do is to account for both dynamism and structure. And there's this sort of, it's just sort of in passing, but I think it's an interesting remark that at the end of that first paragraph where he says it would be difficult to account for a properly mental illness in Bergson's philosophy. So for Bergson, mental reality is, or like the mental reality, properly speaking, is this sort of pure flow of time, and there's no, it's only in connection with spatiality that you end up with some sort of pathology of mental functioning, and so it's hard to see how you can end up with something like a mental illness or a pathology of the mind in a system where the mental or the psychological is sort of identified with the purely dynamic, and there's no structural reality of the mental. And yeah, so for Bergson, there's he distinguishes between these sort of two layers of the superficial self, which is related to spatiality, and the external reality and adaptation to external reality. And then the deeper self, which has to do with this pure flow of time. Whereas for Simondon, what we instead need to be able to do is to to present some sort of transductive relationship between these two orders. So we need the order of simultaneity and the order of succession. We need to have some sort of transductive relationship between the two. So that's sort of the problem that we're starting out from here at the beginning of this section. And then he introduces the question of reflexivity. So there's something about psychological reality which has this reflexive character. So psychological reality is something that sort of presents itself. It has this self-subsistent character, or I shouldn't say self-subsistent, but it psychological reality involves some kind of self-presentation or appearance before itself. And here Simondon distinguishes between the purely biological order and the psychological order. He distinguishes between the two without wanting to make this a substantial distinction. So there's no sort of there isn't a psychological being that is sort of added on to the pre-existing biological being, but at the same time we can distinguish between the living being that only is capable of incorporating the past into its present behavior. So living beings in a wide variety of different parts of the hierarchy or the classification of living beings are capable of learning in some sense, so that the past experience guides present behavior. But what living beings that don't have this psychological reality, what they're not capable of is going in the other direction of taking present behavior as or present reality as the basis for future experience. So making anticipations of the future, and so this is limited or characteristic of psychological reality as opposed to purely biological reality. So it's only at the level of the psychological individual that you can have some sort of homogenization of the past and the present. So the past and the present can both appear as sort of distinct, as appearing at the same ontological level. So you can recall the past and sort of bring it to mind in the same way as something present. And this is what sort of underlies, this capacity underlies the capacity for anticipation or prevision. There's a sort of capacity to make what is present appear as the past of something to come, in the same way as we can make the past appear present when we recall something. We can make the current present appear as the past of a future that hasn't happened yet, and so we have this sort of homogenization capacity with respect to moments of time that the purely living being doesn't have. And so Angus has posted in the chat here a comment that it seems like there's an interiorization of exteriority and vice versa in psychological reality with regard to memory and foresight. We'll see actually, is it in this section or the next one? He actually uses the term dialectic for this relationship of interiority and exteriority, which is a bit surprising because he earlier in the introduction and other parts of this book, we've seen him criticize a certain notion of the dialectic and distinguish transductive reality from dialectics, whereas here he seems to take on this term dialectics as something positive and not something to be criticized. So it's surprising, but we'll talk about that when we get there. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. Let me just get a drink here. Okay. So I'll read the next page or so. The domain of psychological individuality thus appears to be affected by a certain precariousness, for it is defined not only by the composition of a certain number of elements that constitutes a partially unstable idiosyncrasy, but also by self-constitutive dynamism that exists only to the extent that it supports itself and maintains itself in the being. An activity that constructs itself and conditions itself develops on a biological underpinning that provides a more or less abundant, concordant, or discordant idiosyncrasy. This self-constitutive character develops as a problematic without a solution on the level of personal idiosyncrasies. The character is not yet the individual, because it is what poses problems but not what resolves them. If the solution of problems were given in experience, the individual would not exist. The individual exists the moment that a reflexive becoming conscious of the posed problems has allowed the particular being to introduce its idiosyncrasy and its activity, including that of its thought, into the solution. The proper characteristic of the solution on the level of the individual resides in the fact that the individual plays a double role, on the one hand as an element of the data, and on the other hand as an element of the solution. The individual intervenes twice in this problematic, and it is through this double role that it calls itself into question. If, as Vladimir Jankelevich says, every problem is essentially thanatological, this is because the axiomatic of every human problem can only appear to the extent that the individual exists, i.e. establishes a finitude within itself that confers a recurrent circularity onto the problem of which it becomes conscious. If the individual were posited as eternal, none of the problems that appear to it could receive a solution, because the problem could never be dissociated from the subjectivity that the individual confers on it by figuring among the data and the elements of the solution. The problem must be able to be freed from its inherence to individuality, and this requires that the individual only intervene provisionally in the question that it poses. A problem is a problem to the extent that it includes the individual, since it includes the individual doubly in its structure, although the individual seems to appropriate the problem. The individual and the problem surpass one another and sort of intersect according to a schema of mutual inherence. The individual exists to the extent that it poses and resolves a problem, but the problem only exists to the extent that it forces the individual to recognize its temporally and spatially limited nature. The individual is the being that joins within it and outside it, an aspect of the simultaneous and an aspect of the successive. But in this act through which it brings a solution to an aspect of a problem, it becomes determined in order to make a compatibility between these two orders occur, and it is localized and temporalized by becoming universalized. Every individual act is essentially ambiguous, since it is at the point where there is a chiasmus of interiority and exteriority. It is at the limit between interiority and exteriority. Interiority is biological, exteriority is physical. The domain of psychological individuality is at the limit of physical reality and biological reality, between the natural and nature, as an ambivalent relation with the value of being. The domain of psychological individuality, therefore, does not have its own space. It exists as a superimpression relative to the physical and biological domains. It is not inserted between them, properly speaking, but joins them and includes them partially, all while being situated in them. The nature of psychological individuality thus is essentially dialectical, since it only exists to the extent that it establishes a compatibility that passes through itself between nature and the natural, between interiority and exteriority. Biological reality is anterior to psychological reality, but psychological reality takes the biological dynamism back up after being decentered with respect to it. The psychological detour is not an abandonment of life, but an act through which psychological reality becomes decentered relative to biological reality, to be able to grasp in its problematic the rapport of the world and of the ego, the rapport of the physical and of the vital. Psychological reality unfolds as a transductive relation of the world and of the ego. The direct communication of the world and of the ego is not yet psychological. For psychological reality to appear, the implicit link between the world and the ego must be broken and then reconstructed solely through this complex act of two mediations that suppose one another and are mutually called into question in reflexive self-consciousness. There's another comment from Angus. It sounds like the individual has to be finite for the problem to overwhelm the individual and require a solution. Yeah, I think that's right. I think the idea is that if we were to suppose something like an infinite individual, then that that individual would not have this problematic character. So what is characteristic of a finite individual is that it's a problem for itself. So it has to define itself and sort of put itself into question. And this is what Simondon here calls the circularity or the self-constitutive character of psychological reality. And so if you had an infinite individual, then there would be no problematic character of that individual for itself. And so it would not be a psychological individual. It would be something completely different that we probably wouldn't be able to understand. So there's this notion here that Simondon introduces of the double role of the individual. So the individual, on the one hand, is part, whenever we're faced with a problem, in the proper sense of the term, the individual on the one hand is part of the data of the problem or the given aspect of the problem. So whenever you run into some sort of situation where that requires some solution of a problem, part of what is given in that problem is what sort of capacities and preferences and habits and so on that you bring to the equation. But then at the same time, the individual is also part of the solution of the problem. So it appears on the other side of the equation as well. So part of what you do when you solve a problem is precisely to make a choice about what kind of person or what kind of individual you're going to end up being. So you acquire new capacities or you lose capacities that you had previously. You acquire new habits or lose old ones and so on. So you become a slightly different person just by solving a problem. You're a different individual than you were before solving that problem. And then so this idea of this circular nature of psychological reality, or this self-constitutive character of psychological reality, also brings up this notion of the relationship, this dialectical relationship between interiority and exteriority. So the individual, through solving a problem or through this problem solution, has to do with bringing about a compatibility between internal and external. With here we think of the internal as biological, and the external as physical, and then so the psychological reality would be sort of the boundary between the two. It would be the way that each one affects the other and is sort of transferred into, and this psychological reality at the limit between biological and physical, or between interior and exterior, would itself be a relation in the proper sense of the term for Simondon. So it's a relation that has ontological status. It's not a purely external relation. And then he brings up, and again, as I mentioned, he uses this term dialectical here, which we sort of would not expect him to use for his own theory or his own proposals, because, as I mentioned, he's criticized the dialectic before in this book. But here it has to do with the way that interiority and exteriority each sort of pass into each other. So psychological reality is only in this transition of exterior into interior and vice versa. So yeah, I think it's more than just communication. So we have communication in the sense that there is a sort of input of signals from the physical reality into the biological being. So we receive information through vision and hearing and so on from the physical world surrounding us as biological. But I think what is going on here is more than just that it's pure communication. We instead have something like a transition of interior into exterior and vice versa, which has to do with this making compatible the different orders of temporality. So we in solving a problem, we are we're making the simultaneous and the successive compatible. And so this goes back to from a couple paragraphs earlier where he talked about the way that psychological reality is what first makes possible foresight by making time homogeneous. So in the same way, we make the successive and the simultaneous compatible with each other when we solve a problem. And this making compatible is a sort of exteriorization of the internal. There's like in solving a problem, we at the same time transform ourselves. The individual that solves a problem undergoes a transformation, and so becomes a somewhat different individual than it was previously. So this interior becomes exterior, and then likewise, the what was exterior, what was the given of the problem, becomes transformed into the interior, becomes the solution to the problem, and yeah, so there's a sort of reciprocal transformation and not just a communication.
This section makes me think of the discussion of the present in vital individuation with the moment of selective assimilation in the cell, with, I guess, the interior being something like the past, or the successive, and the exterior being the future or the simultaneous or something like that. And then there's this, I guess it's similar in that there's the moment between them that causes them to correspond, which is the selective assimilation in the cell and reflexivity in psychological reality.
Right, yeah. So we have we can also, so I would also point back to the distinction that he makes between physical reality and vital reality with respect to temporality. So in the case of the crystal, for example, we have this strict correspondence between interior and anterior. So the crystal forms by layers, and each layer is sort of deposited on top of the last one, and the interior of the crystal is strictly anterior in time to the exterior of the crystal, and only the outer layer that is forming at any given moment is fully present in that sense. And he points out that the crystal, you can actually just hollow out the inside of the crystal, and the exterior will still grow in the same way. And so everything inside the crystal is anterior in time in a sort of radical way in comparison with the layer of the present. Whereas in living beings, the living being is simultaneous to itself in a way that the crystal is not. So that the living being is, through its reciprocal interaction of all the different parts of its body, it has this simultaneity with itself. It's the interior of the living being is just as present as the external surface of that living being, and so there's a different relationship between the topology of the living being and its time relation, as opposed to in the case of physical reality. Here, in the case of psychological reality, I think it's a sort of reproducing the same relationship at a higher level. So, in the case of living reality, of living beings, they're simultaneous to themselves, but at the same time, the past of that living being becomes past by being incorporated into the present. So the past experience of that living being makes it learn and changes its behavior. But it's only in psychological reality when you can actually recall the past and make the past present that you have some sort of simultaneity of past and present, if that makes sense. It makes the past into something that can become present, and then it makes the present into something that can become past for the future to come after. So it has this simultaneity effect on the moments of time as well. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. I think we're at whence results for the psyche. If someone else would like to read.
Yeah, I can read this. Whence results for the psyche the necessity to unfold through mediations endowed with reciprocity. Since its domain is that of relation but not of possession, it can only be constituted by what it constitutes. This reciprocity of the subject and the object appears in the individual problematic because what the object of the problem is for the consciousness that posits it, the subject of this consciousness is for the world that contains this object. This double situation is inherent to the opposition of realism and nominalism. However, this dialectical relation of the individual to the world is transductive because it unfolds a homogeneous and heterogeneous, consistent and continuous but diversified world, a world which neither belongs to physical nature nor to life, but to this universe in the process of constitution that can be called mind, esprit. Yet this universe constructs the transductivity of life and of the physical world through knowledge and through action. The reciprocity of knowledge and of action allows this world to be constituted not just as a mixture, but as a veritable transductive relation. Everything that is constructed by the individual, everything that is apprehensible by the individual is homogeneous, whatever the degree of spatial and temporal diversity that affects the elements of this constructed universe may be. All individual realities can be ordered in continuous series without radical heterogeneity. Every reality can be understood either as physical being, as vital gesture, or as individual activity. This third order of reality establishes a transductivity that partially and incompletely joins the preceding orders that are commensurate with the existence of psychological individuals. The inclusion of the elements of the first two orders in the third is the work of the individual and expresses the individual. Nevertheless, this inclusion is never complete because it requires the existence of physical and biological underpinnings. Just as there cannot be an entirely biological world, there cannot be an entirely psychological world. Psychological individual could also appear to belong to a psychological world, but here an illusion arising from an overly facile analogy must be prevented. Properly speaking, a psychological world within which individuals would be distinguished and defined after the fact does not exist. The psychological world is constituted by the relation of psychological individuals. In this case, the individuals are anterior to the world and are constituted based on non-psychological worlds. The relation of the physical and biological worlds to the psychological world passes through the individual. The psychological world must be called the transindividual universe rather than the psychological world, since the latter does not have an independent existence. For example, culture is not a reality that subsists of itself. It only exists to the extent that cultural monuments and expressions are reactualized by individuals and included by them as bearers of significations. What can be transmitted is nothing but the universality of a problematic, which is in fact the universality of an individual situation created through space and time. Yet the psychological world exists to the extent that each individual finds before it a series of mental schemata and of behaviors already incorporated in culture that compel the individual to pose its particular problems according to a normativity previously elaborated by other individuals. The psychological individual must choose among the values and behaviors from which it receives examples. But not everything is given in culture, and we must distinguish between culture and transindividual reality. Culture is neutral in a certain sense. It has to be polarized by the subject that calls itself into question. On the contrary, there is, in the transindividual relation, the requirement of the subject to be called into question by himself. Because this calling into question is already begun by others. The decentering of the subject relative to himself is carried out in part by others in the inter-individual relation. However, it should be noted that the inter-individual relation can obscure the transindividual relation to the extent that a purely functional mediation is made available as an easy option that avoids the veritable position of the problem of the individual by the individual himself. The inter-individual relation can remain a simple rapport and avoid reflexivity. Pascal has felt and noted quite vividly the antagonism between diversion and the reflexive consciousness of the problem of the individual. To the extent that the inter-individual relation offers a prior validation of the ego grasped as a persona through the functional representation that others have formed of it, this relation avoids the acuteness of the calling into question of oneself by oneself. Should I stop there?
Yeah, I think this is like a multi-page paragraph, so let's stop there.
I actually think there are a lot of compatibilities with Heidegger here, at least in the idea of like kind of authentic possibilities being determined by facticity and the inter-individual calling or covering up the possible trans-individual relation.
Yeah, I think Heidegger is not really a sort of explicit reference point for Simondon in general. I don't think he cites him. Well, Simondon doesn't really cite his sources in general very much. But Heidegger, I think he mentions in the book on technical objects at some point, but I don't recall him mentioning Heidegger anywhere else. But yeah, I think we can. I think it's fair to draw analogies between the two. Definitely with relation to finitude, as we saw in the last paragraph, and some notion of authenticity that has to do with something that goes beyond the individual as an already individuated being. I think those are fair points of comparison. One translation note on this bit here is that so in that right near the bottom of 311, where the translation says mind, so it says a world which neither belongs to physical nature nor to life, but to this universe in the process of constitution that could be called mind. And then he put the French word here, esprit. I think here it would be better to translate this as spirit rather than mind. I think Simondon is explicitly calling back to Hegel here, and this notion of this reality, this domain of reality that we can call spirit, as something that is distinct from purely psychological reality of an individual, and also from physical reality. It's a sort of distinct layer of reality that surpasses any individual's psychological reality. And I think, and especially because we have seen this term dialectics come up, or dialectical relation come up in these last couple paragraphs. I think the reference to Hegel is especially likely here. I think that's what he has in mind, or what he's sort of building off of in this paragraph. And then maybe another terminological question, not a translation, but when Simondon here talks about, again, near the bottom of 311, maybe 10 lines up or so, he talks about the opposition of realism and nominalism. So this has to do with, like, these terms come from medieval philosophy, and they have to do with the reality of universals. And so realism means the position that holds that universals have a independent existence. So there's something like the form of the horse, or the form of man, or something like that, which has an independent existence. Whereas nominalism holds that universals exist only insofar as their names. So we have a name for horses, or a name for dogs, or whatever, and it's only in those names that something like a universal exists. So they have a purely linguistic, right. But that bit about realism and nominalism is a bit obscure. He only sort of mentions in passing this opposition between realism and nominalism, and he doesn't really develop what the connection is with psychological reality. So yeah, that's kind of an obscure point, I think, to that. Yeah, hoarseness is the whatness of all horse. Yes. Yeah, there's all kinds of subtleties having to do with, like, the different positions. Like, is there such a thing as the essence of a horse, or is that distinct from, like, the horse as such, and so on. Like, yeah, medieval philosophy is always very subtle and difficult to pin down. Right. But yeah, so here we have the idea that there's no psychological world, properly speaking, or what we call the psychological world, in opposition to the biological world, is a sort of it's a sort of illusion to talk about the psychological world. There's only it's only through the individual that there is something like a psychological world, this realm of spirit. So there's only something like culture, insofar as different whatever monuments, or written books, or whatever other cultural artifacts have a place in the life of individuals, that they have some sort of cultural value. So there's only a psychological world insofar as individuals sort of constitute that world, as opposed to, in the case of the biological worlds, the world and the biological individual are sort of correlated realities that appear at the same level of at the same stage of the process of individuation. Whereas in the case of the psychological world, it's something that is dependent on the already existing psychological individual.
I had a question about that idea. It seems like the psychological reality exists at the border between the biological and the physical. But I guess what's not clear to me is what existence the cultural world has before it is taken up by the individual. It's presumably like it can be taken up in part by some people and not by others. I don't know if it would be considered biological or physical for Simondon before it's taken up.
I think the way that, or how I would understand it, is that for each given individual, the psychological world or the cultural sphere or spirit, or whichever term we want to use, appears as something given to that individual. So when an individual is born and grows up, they always grow up in a certain society with its own culture and everything. So the cultural reality already exists in its own sort of ontological register, I guess we can say. But that existence only happens through the operation of psychological individuals. So there isn't a temporal distinction between like one moment where there would be a psychological individual without a cultural reality, and then a second moment where cultural reality would exist. It's at each moment you have both, but it's only there's like an ontological dependence from of the psychological world on the psychological individual. And so again, this is something that this is a contrast with the biological reality, where the world and the individual are both appearing at the same time. They both appear through the same process of individuation, with the biological world or the environment of an organism being the sort of leftover of the process of individuation through which that individual arises. Right, and then this is sort of what Simondon gets at in the next paragraph, where he talks about how the individual comes to the psychological world as a sort of repertoire of already elaborated already elaborated normativity. So the individual, as it is born and grows up, is already surrounded by judgments of what is normal and pathological, or what is valuable or not valuable, or desirable and not desirable, and so on. There's all these normative judgments that are already present before the individual is able to even make decisions or make judgments about what preferences they have, and so on. So the individual sort of comes into the world as a world that already has this psychological valence, or this normative valence to it, and the individual has to sort of select out of this existing repertoire of normativity which norms or which behaviors to adopt and take on. So there's only a finite set of norms that you can adopt, or that you can live up to. You can only do so much in a finite lifespan, and so we're sort of forced to select from this repertoire of all these given norms. And a question from Angus: does the interior individual have psychological reality for Simondon, or is it something else? Yeah, that's a good question. I think I think if we want to maintain that distinction that he made a long time ago now, but where he talks about the interindividual as distinct from the transindividual, I think he would not want to say that the interindividual has psychological reality, so that it's only at the level of the transindividual that there's something like well, I don't want to say exactly a psychological reality, but psychological reality sort of is continuous with the transindividual reality, I guess is the way I would put it. There's as we've seen in a few previous sections, the individual is not at the level of the psychological individual is not capable of resolving all of the problems that it faces on its own. It's only through association with the collective that that these problems can be resolved. But I think that collective is always at the level or always takes the form of the transindividual rather than the interindividual. So I think we would have to regard interindividual connections as something distinct from psychological reality. I think, yeah, I hope that makes sense. So yeah, something like behaviors. Yeah, so when he talks about interindividual reality, he's thinking, I think, of something like the example that he gave in that passage from a long time back, I think in the part on vital individuation. He mentions exchange as a sort of instance of interindividual relationship. So you have one already constituted individual that has certain preferences and has certain possessions, and then you have another individual that has different preferences or different possessions, and they exchange their possessions with each other to maximize each other's for each of them to maximize their preferences, and so this is a relationship in which the two individuals are already constituted. They already have their preferences set, and there's no problem solving aspect to this relationship. There's no sort of calling into question of the being of these individuals. So this is like a type of paradigm case for interindividual relationships. So it's some sort of connection between already constituted individuals that doesn't call into question the being of the. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. So I think we're right near the top of 313. Let's see. Yeah, this is a long paragraph. I can read this. Part. See, where did we leave off? I think we're at on the contrary. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. On the contrary, the veritable transindividual relation only begins beyond solitude. It is constituted by the individual who called himself into question and not by the convergent sum of interindividual rapports. Pascal discovers transindividuality in a reciprocal relation with Christ. I have shed my blood for thee, Christ said, and the man who has managed to remain alone understands that Christ is in agony until the end of time. There must be no sleeping during that time, Pascal said. The veritable individual is one who has traversed solitude. What the individual discovers beyond solitude is the presence of a transindividual relation. The individual finds the universality of relation at the end of the trial that is imposed on him, and this trial is one of isolation. We believe that this reality is independent of any religious context, or rather it is anterior to any religious context and is in fact the common basis for all religious forces when it is translated into religion. The source of all religions is not society, as certain sociological thoughts have wanted to show, but the transindividual. This force is socialized, institutionalized only afterwards. It is not social in its essence. Nietzsche shows Zarathustra taking refuge in his cave at the top of the mountains to find solitude, which allows him to foresee the enigma of the universe and to speak to the sun. He isolates himself from other men to the point of being able to say, "You great star, what would your happiness be had you not known those for whom you shine?" The trans-individual relation is that of Zarathustra to his disciples, or that of Zarathustra to the tightrope walker who lies broken on the ground in front of him and who has been abandoned by the crowd. The crowd only considered the funambulist in terms of his function. It abandons him when he ceases to perform his function after his death. On the contrary, Zarathustra feels himself to be the man's brother, and he carries off his corpse to give him a proper burial. It is with solitude, in this presence of Zarathustra to a dead friend abandoned by the crowd, that the trial of trans-individuality begins. What Nietzsche describes as the event of wanting to climb onto his own shoulders is the act of every man who undergoes the trial of solitude to discover trans-individuality. However, Zarathustra does not discover a creator god in his solitude, but the pantheistic presence of a world submitted to eternal return. Zarathustra, dying, holds the earth in his arms. The trial is thus anterior to the discovery of the trans-individual, or at the very least anterior to the discovery of all the trans-individual. The example of Nietzsche's Zarathustra is invaluable, for it shows that the trial itself is often guided and initiated by the flash of an exceptional event that makes man conscious of his destiny and leads him to feel the necessity of the trial. If Zarathustra hadn't felt this absolute and profound fraternity with the tightrope walker, he would not have left the village to seek refuge in the cave at the top of the mountain. A first encounter between the individual and trans-individual reality is necessary, and if this encounter can only be an exceptional situation that externally presents the aspects of a revelation. But in fact, the trans-individual is self-constitutive, and Pascal's phrase, "You would not seek me if you had not found me," if it accounts for the role of the individual's activity in the discovery of the trans-individual, seems to presuppose the transcendent existence of a being in which the origin of all trans-individuality resides. Neither the idea of imminence nor the idea of transcendence can account completely for the characteristics of the trans-individual with respect to the psychological individual. Transcendence or imminence are indeed defined and determined before the moment that the individual becomes one of the terms of the relation into which it is integrated, and whose other term was already given. However, if it is admitted that the trans-individual is self-constitutive, it will be seen that the schema of transcendence or the schema of imminence only account for this self-constitution through their simultaneous and reciprocal position. Each moment of self-constitution involves the definition of the rapport between the individual and the trans-individual as that which surpasses the individual by extending it. The trans-individual is not exterior to the individual, and yet becomes detached from the individual to a certain extent. Furthermore, this transcendence that takes root in interiority, or rather at the limit of interiority and exteriority, does not bring about a dimension of exteriority, but a dimension of excess relative to the individual. The fact that the trial of trans-individuality was able to be interpreted sometimes as a recourse to a superior and exterior force, and sometimes as a deepening of interiority, according to Augustine's formulas, in te redi in interiori homine habitat veritas. Return to yourself, truth resides in everyone. Or even, Deus interior intimo meo, Deus superior superimo meo. God is higher than my highest and more interior than my innermost self. Shows that at the very start, this fundamental ambiguity exists. The trans-individual is neither exterior nor superior. It characterizes the true relation between every exteriority and every interiority relative to the individual. Perhaps the dialectical formula according to which man must go from the exterior to the interior, and from the interior to the superior, could also articulate the passage from interiority to exteriority prior to the access to superior things. For it is in the relation between exteriority and interiority that the starting point of trans-individuality is constituted. Okay, so this was a sort of a long passage with a lot of different things going on here. So we have to start with this idea that which is a sort of a paradoxical idea, but the idea that our access to the trans-individual comes through solitude, or as Simondon puts it here, the veritable trans-individual relation only begins beyond solitude. So this is related to what I was talking about a little while ago about distinguishing the trans-individual from the inter-individual. So even though the trans-individual is a kind of collective reality, it's always a reality that is not the reality of like a group of people just sort of coming together and like averaging over the sum of those people or something like that. It's a kind of reality that we only have access to through this solitude or this what he also calls the trial. So there's a sort of suffering that we have to undergo in order to gain access to the trans-individual. It's not something that is sort of easily achieved. And I think it is fair to make a comparison here again with Heidegger, that there's this individualizing nature of anxiety. So anxiety serves as the determination that allows for something like authenticity to be possible. It's through anxiety that that Dasein is given to itself as a problem. So I think we can make that comparison here. And I think, trans-individual reality being something that we access through solitude, I think is sort of a key moment that is maybe easy to overlook when Simondon talks about, like as we saw in previous sections, he sometimes talks about how the individual, the psychological individual can't solve all its own problems, and it has to sort of go to the level of the collective. But it's sort of a subtle meaning or what exactly he means when he says that certain problems can only be solved at the level of the collective is a kind of subtle point, because here we only access the collective through solitude. So there's like if emotion is something, if emotion as opposed to affectivity is something that is only if there's only if emotion as opposed to affectivity is something that can only be brought about at the level of the collective, that doesn't necessarily mean that the level of the collective consists of like a group of people or something like that. It has to do with the way that the access to the collective is through solitude. So emotion might also at the same time be something that we experience in solitude, as opposed to affectivity that we might also experience in groups. So it can take on this sort of paradoxical form here. And then we have these sort of sketches of a couple of authors that that talk about this, what Simondon identifies as trans-individual reality. So Pascal and Nietzsche as the sort of key reference points here. So of course for Pascal it's in reference to a sort of transcendent divinity. So for Pascal, it's a transcendent God who calls the individual into question, whereas for Nietzsche, the relation is to some sort of quasi-pantheistic understanding of the worlds through eternal return. What exactly that eternal return means is, of course, like a pretty debated point in Nietzsche scholarship, but it seems to involve some kind of experience of the world as as having this sort of divine quality to it. So in this experience of the eternal return, we are no longer sort of separate from the world as something distinct from us, but we have this sort of unification with the world, and the world appears to us as something divine, or as having the divine in it. Yeah, it allows you to will the past. I mean, my sort of amateur understanding of it is that when you have this grasp of the sort of chain of determination, that everything that led up to this moment, it was necessary, that there was no sort of rule of freedom in leading up to this moment, then you have this sort of experience of affirmation of everything in the past, even all the humiliations that you went through and suffering and everything in your life that you maybe in other moments would like to forget or wish had never happened, and so on. In this moment of eternal return, you experience everything as all of those moments as part of this necessary chain that leads up to the present, and so that it's impossible for you to will anything other than what actually happened, because those moments are what make your will what it is now, and so it's, I think, connected with Spinoza's idea of the amor fati, the love of fate, or but anyway, that's maybe a bit of an aside. But here in this context, I think for Simondon, what Nietzsche is presenting with this experience of the eternal return is something something divine appearing within the individual. So Pascal and Nietzsche are sort of serving as the two opposite poles here, where for Pascal, this experience or this trial is something that happens through a transcendent God, whereas for Nietzsche, there's this sort of immanent divine principle that appears within human reality, that brings about this trial by solitude. But in each case, what Simondon argues here is that what these two authors are talking about, the reality behind what they're discussing, is the transindividual reality. And so Simondon argues that this transindividual reality is what underlies religion. It's not itself something religious, but it's the transindividual reality is what religions are sort of based on. And I think he's here criticizing Durkheim and the idea that the basis of religion is a sort of mythologized version of the social order, as something that would already be constituted. And so the transindividual reality is not something that is already individuated and constituted and given. It's something that has to be brought about through an individuation. And so Simondon argues that this is actually more fundamental than the social. Right. And so this transindividual reality is something that that goes beyond the individual, but at the same time, it does so by extending the individual. So it's only transindividual reality is not something external to the individual in the way that we can picture in the transcendence picture, where you would have a divinity outside of me sort of brings about this experience of the transindividual reality. So in this picture, we're already starting from an individual. The God is supposed to be an individual, and we don't have something like a genesis of the individual. And then likewise, if we start from the imminence picture, we end up with a picture of transindividual reality, or this experience of the transindividual as something that that is arising from within the already constituted reality of the individual. And so we again don't end up with a genetic account of this transindividual reality. So what we are looking for is an understanding of transindividual reality that would give a genetic account, or would present the process of individuation through which we come to have this experience of the transindividual. And then he again references the dialectical formula here on right at the top of 315. So and again, it's in the context of this relationship between exterior and interior. So there's somehow this relationship between exterior and interior, which is what psychological reality consists in, is at the same time it sort of points beyond itself to transindividual reality. There's a sort of reciprocity, or double movement of the exterior to the interior and the interior to the exterior, which at the same time points beyond itself to the transindividual reality. So I think this is sort of what he means when he talks about how, where is that, a little bit earlier on 314, when he says that the transindividual surpasses the individual by extending it. So the transindividual reality is not something distinct from the individual psychological reality. It's something that the individual psychological reality already points towards the transindividual reality. Let's see, where are we? I don't think we have time to finish this section today. We have like another couple pages. So I would suggest that we stop here for today, and we'll pick up from 315 next time. So thank you, everyone. A small group today, but yeah, this is one of the key parts of this book, I think, of this this part on psychological reality. I think this is sort of the key moment of that whole part.